Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page, and it's Thursday morning, November 18th, 2021. Good to see folks joining on the stream this morning. We're ready for Ezekiel 23 today. Good morning, Linda. Ezekiel chapter 23 is where we'll be starting. There's Gail. And we're also, let's see here, cross-posted onto the Near Churches page. All right. Since it's Thursday, as you know, this will be our last stream of this week, and I was going to try to do a couple chapters today, but the contents of 23, well, I just don't think we need to rush through it. So we're just going to do chapter 23 today. Good morning, Brian, and good morning, Connie. And Connie, I got you covered, so no worries. I'll get that out in the mail just as soon as I head home for lunch. Good morning. What is that? Is it Kiza from Uganda? Good to have you on the stream this morning. As always, if y'all have any questions or comments as I'm going through, please feel free to use the comment section, and I will address them when I see them. Like I said, we're ready for Ezekiel chapter 23 today. And the book of Ezekiel is so, I guess one word I would use to describe it would be heavy. There's a lot of heavy stuff in here in terms of judgment. Good morning, Diana. In terms of judgment, condemnation, but I tell you, one of the good things about Ezekiel, and I suppose the other prophets too, is that it's so easily connected with so many other parts of Scripture that you'll read something and it's like, yeah, I know right where that is, over in Kings or Chronicles. Excuse me. And we're gonna make some of those connections today with what's being written here in Ezekiel chapter 23. So the first 21 verses of this chapter deals with, and the term that the New King James uses, and repeatedly, and I didn't take time to count how many times this is used, but the idea of harlotry, okay, whoredom, prostitution, basically. That would be our modern term that we would use. Good morning, Sheila. Their spiritual prostitution, and so just go ahead and basically preview it for you. This prostitution is in verse 30 referred to as their idolatry. The idolatry that God's people, both southern Israel and northern Israel, had adopted throughout time. And so the first 21 verses of this chapter deal with that, and then verses 22 through 49 deals with the judgment. So it's a lengthy chapter, and I want to give it the proper amount of time I think that it deserves. And so here in the first 4 verses, again, it's kind of heavy language, but it illustrates well what God was dealing with His people who had abandoned Him, who were sold into idolatry, and as such, spiritual adultery. All right, that's the language that's used here in prostitution. So here we go. First 4 verses. Son of man, there were 2 women, the daughters of one mother. They committed harlotry in Egypt. They committed harlotry in their youth. And again, the word we would use today would be prostitution. All right, they were prostituting themselves. Their breasts were there embraced, their virgin bosom was there pressed. So again, that's pretty, what's the word? What is the word? Well, it's pretty plain. We're not missing the point that he's making here. All right, they were prostitutes. Their names, and he gives them a name, and these are in this chapter, Ezekiel 23 is the only place we find these names, but they have meaning. Their names, Oholah, the elder, and Oholibah, her sister. So let's look at those terms just real quick. Oholah, the meaning of that name is meaning her own tabernacle. All right, and we'll kind of lay out why that's used here. And then Oholibah, her sister, means my tabernacle is with her. Okay, so there's significance in these names. They were mine, God says, verse 4. And they bore sons and daughters. As for their names, Samaria is Oholah. Samaria throughout the prophets is a reference to the capital of northern Israel. Okay, this would be what we refer to as the 10 northern tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. Samaria serves as their capital. You will remember after the kingdom split, okay, after the death of Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam became king of southern Israel, Judah, and Jeroboam, one of Solomon's servants, became king of northern Israel. And Jeroboam, one of the things that he did to keep the faithfulness of the northern tribes to him, so that they wouldn't go back to Jerusalem. And all of this is in 1 Kings chapters 11 and 12, by the way, mainly 1 Kings chapter 12. But he changed the place of worship, the objects of worship. He set up 2 golden calves in Israel, one in Dan and one in Beersheba. And his reasoning was, listen, it's too hard for everybody to go all the way to Jerusalem to worship, and so we'll set up these golden calves. And he kind of became the standard of sin for the rest of the kings of Israel, northern Israel specifically. And so Samaria, as the text here says, is Oholah, northern Israel. And Jerusalem, southern Israel, Jerusalem is the capital of Judah. Jerusalem is Oholibah. All right, so now in verses 5 through 9, he talks about the older sister, as she is called, Oholah, northern Israel, where Samaria is the capital. Well, she played the harlot. She lusted for her lovers, verse 5. Good morning, Owsleys. And the lovers are specifically identified as the Assyrians. But here again, the way this is laid out in our text here in the book of Ezekiel is we can go back and look at this happening. So I'm going to take my Bible back real quick to 2 Kings chapter 15. And this, it's good to read the text of the Bible. Like if you sit down and you say, okay, I'm going to take 1 week and read through the book of Ezekiel. That's good, all right? But it's also good to be able to make these connections with other biblical texts. So again, Ezekiel 23 and verse 5, northern Israel, Oholah, lusted after the neighboring Assyrians. All right, so you turn back to 2 Kings chapter 15 to get, okay, what is he talking about? What does that mean? 2 Kings 15 beginning, let's see, I wrote it down here, beginning in verse 17, yeah. In the 39th year of Azariah, king of Judah, all right, that's southern Israel, Menahem, the son of Gadi, became king over Israel. All right, that's Samaria, Oholah of Ezekiel 23, and reigned 10 years in Samaria. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart all his days from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. That's what I was talking about. Jeroboam, he kind of set the bar for sin. And a lot of the other kings are compared to him when they sin. Pul, king of Assyria, came against the land. And Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him, to strengthen the kingdom under his control. And Menahem exacted the money from Israel, from all the very wealthy, from each man 50 shekels of silver, to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and did not stay there in the land. See, this is one of the problems with the monarchy. You remember when Israel came before Samuel, and this is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 8. They're tired of the judges. Okay, for 400 years, they've had judges, and they say, listen, you're old, your sons they're not godly people, give us a king. And Samuel resisted, you remember, but God told Samuel, listen, give them what they ask for. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And so the monarchy starts with, of course, Saul, the son of Kish of Benjamin, and essentially then it goes downhill from there. One of the things was, though, in their request for a king, initially during the days of Samuel, they're already in the process of turning their faith away from God. They're not dependent upon God. Well, then when you get kings, it becomes even worse. They think you make these political ties with like the Assyrians there in 2 Kings chapter 15, and those Assyrians can protect you. And it's like God told Samuel in 1 Samuel 8, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. And that's exactly what plays out throughout their history, specifically here, again, back to Ezekiel 23, verses 5 through 10, with northern Israel. They're destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. And 2 Kings all the way through chapter 17 records that history for us, all right? 1st and 2nd Kings focuses on both northern and southern Israel. 2nd Chronicles focuses only on Judah and southern Israel. And so Ezekiel tells us this story here. Israel is fornicating. They're prostituting themselves with the Assyrians. So what happens? Well, you go down to verse 9, back to Ezekiel 23 now. Therefore I've delivered her, Aholah, Samaria, into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians for whom she lusted. They uncovered her nakedness. They took away her sons and daughters and slew her with the sword. That's talking about the end of the nation. And if you want to read that, read 2 Kings chapter 17 because it lays it out very clearly. Okay? So that's your first, that's verses 5 through 10. The older sister, Aholah, is northern Israel, also called Samaria, and they fell to the Assyrians. And they were prostituting themselves. Then you begin in verse 11, and southern Israel, Oholibah, the younger sister, is called to account, let's say. And one of the points that's made here is, listen, the younger sister should have looked at the older sister and learned from her mistakes, but they didn't. And not only did they not learn from their older sister, they got worse. So beginning in verse 11, now although her sister, Oholibah, saw this, okay, Judah witnessed the destruction of Israel because of her spiritual fornication. Although she saw this, she became more corrupt in her lust than she, and in her prostitution more corrupt than her sister's prostitution. She lusted for the Assyrians. All right, so if you want to read that, you would take your Bible back to the book of 2 Kings again. This time you would go to 2 Kings chapter 16, all right? And you would start reading in verse 7. And one of the things we learn here in 2 Kings 16 is that southern Israel, or Judah, they have an enemy, the Syrians, not the Assyrians, the Syrians, all right? And so what do they do when they're in trouble with the Syrians? 2 Kings 16:7. Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. And by the way, Tiglath-Pileser, that's Pul. All right, this is the same king that we're talking about here from 2 Kings 15. Come up and save me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand... So Ahaz takes money, gives it to the Assyrians for protection. Well, what's the problem? They're prostituting themselves with these heathen nations instead of depending upon God. They're fornicating spiritually with the Assyrians for their protection. And that's exactly what God told Samuel would happen. Samuel, they've not rejected you. They've rejected me. So this plays out here then in the rest of Ezekiel chapter 23. So not only do you have the Assyrians, Ezekiel 23, 12 through 16, but now the Babylonians are introduced in Ezekiel 23, beginning in verse 17. And with the historical context, the Babylonians, okay, now we're talking about Ezekiel's day. Then the Babylonians came to her, verse 17, into the bed of love. And again, the language is very strong and unmistakable. And they defiled her with their immorality. She was defiled by them and alienated herself from them. She revealed her prostitution and uncovered her nakedness. That's very similar, familiar language to a student of the Old Testament. Uncovering someone's nakedness, all right? So like read Leviticus 18 and you'll get a precise picture of what that means. So the Assyrians, the Babylonians, they're lusting after them, and there are going to be consequences, and that's what starts in verse 22. So the older sister, northern Israel, Samaria, Oholah, she's been put to death by the sword, all right? That's verses 5 through 10. Well, what about Oholibah, the younger sister, southern Israel? Well, that starts in verse 22. I will stir up your lovers against you from whom you have alienated yourself, and I will bring them against you from every side, the Babylonians, all the Chaldeans, Pekod, Shoah, Koah. Those are regions along the Tigris River where which is the realm of the Babylonians. All the Assyrians with them, all of their desirable young men. So you prostituted yourself with them. You sought their protection and their alliances. Now they're going to, essentially, now they're going to take advantage of you. And so from verses 24 through 27, there's this description of southern Israel, Judah, Oholibah, as it's called, being humiliated publicly by one of her former lovers, all right, Babylon. So then notice beginning in verse 28 here. For thus says the Lord God, surely I will deliver you into the hand of those you hate, into the hand of those from whom you alienated yourself. Well, at one time they're seeking alliances, but then, hey, now they're enemies. Well, God says, I'll take care of you. I'll deliver you into their hand. They will deal hatefully with you to take away all you have worked for and leave you naked and bare. The nakedness of your prostitution shall be uncovered, both your lewdness and your harlotry. So again, very provocative. Let's use that word. Very provocative language here that's being used. I will do these things to you. Why? Because you have gone as a harlot. You've gone as a prostitute after the Gentiles. And here it is. Because you have become defiled by their idols. So this imagery of prostitution is fully defined for us here. It's their acceptance of these Gentiles and their idolatrous ways. You have walked in the way of your sister. Southern Israel became just like northern Israel, and even worse. Therefore, I will put her cup in your hand. And that's an interesting metaphor. This idea of cup is the idea of judgment. We see that in the book of Revelation. The enemies of God would drink, how's it phrased? They would drink of the cup of the wrath of God. And it's unmixed. It's undiluted. They're going to receive the full measure of God's wrath. That's the picture here. You shall drink of your sister's cup, verse 32, the deep and wide one. You shall be laughed to scorn and held in derision. It contains much. So that's a word of warning about the judgment that's coming. The reason, verse 35, because you have forgotten me, cast me behind your back, therefore you shall bear the penalty of your lewdness and your prostitution. Again, the idea here presented time and time again is of sexual promiscuity, trying to be with everyone she can be with for the benefits that they might bestow upon her. Well, now they're all enemies, and God's going to consume his people because of their spiritual promiscuity. So then the rest of the chapter, Ezekiel 23, beginning in verse 36 here, is just descriptive of the judgment that's going to take place. For instance, you look at verse 37. They've committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. They have committed adultery with their idols, and even sacrificed their sons, whom they bore to me, passing them through the fire to devour them. And one of those connections that we can make politically is with Manasseh, one of the final kings of Judah. If you remember, he reigned for 55 years, and he caused his sons to pass through the fire. Now, that's not unique to Manasseh among the kings of Israel and Judah, but it's like he kind of, he's like Jeroboam. He kind of set the standard of wickedness and even child sacrifice. And so this is why they're being judged. Now, here's something else interesting that comes out. Notice beginning in verse 38 here. Moreover, they have done this to me. They have defiled my sanctuary on the same day, listen, and profaned my Sabbaths. For after they had slain their children for their idols, okay, causing their children to pass through the fire, on the same day they came into my sanctuary to profane it. And indeed, thus they have done in the midst of my house. They worship God and gods on the same day. Now, if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 17, again, it outlines this for us very plainly here. 2 Kings 17, really beginning in verse 29, and you read down through verse 33. I'm just going to read verse 32 and 33 of 2 Kings 17. So they feared the Lord, and from every class they appointed for themselves priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places, okay, idol worship. They feared the Lord, Jehovah, yet they served their own gods, according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were carried away. That's exactly what Ezekiel's talking about here. The older sister, northern Israel, had done it, and now the younger sister, Judah, was doing it and was doing it more. So the rest of the chapter, it just closes out this concept of what they were doing, as if Assyria and Babylon were not enough. You start reading in verse 40. Furthermore, you sent for men to come from afar, to whom a messenger was sent. And here's the picture here. So you've got this prostitute who's been used by multiple people. Well, now she calls for another person. And again, the imagery, this is Judah doing this. And so you start reading there in the middle of verse 41. You washed yourself for them. You painted your eyes. You adorned yourself with ornaments. You sat on a stately couch. Well, she's preparing for her next, her next lover. Of course, spiritually speaking here, but we get the language. And it says, the sound of a carefree multitude was with her, and Sabaeans were brought forth. And that word Sabaeans means base or lewd people. They're seeking protection and provision from everybody but God. And that's why they're ultimately being destroyed. They had grown old. Look at verse 43 here. They had grown old in their adulteries. It's an ongoing practice. They're lewd women, verse 44. They're going to be judged by righteous men. Well, Ezekiel's one of those, and that's talked about throughout this book. And then you look at verse 48, and we'll wrap it up. He says, thus I will cause lewdness to cease from the land, that all women may be taught not to practice your lewdness. They shall repay you for your lewdness. So one thing that the Babylonian captivity did for southern Israel was it dealt with the idol problem. They didn't have a problem with idols after that. Now they moved on into other problems. And when you come in then to the pages of the New Testament, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees and these groups that are very ritualistic. I think that's a good word to use. They're not worshiping the idols, but now they've gone in another direction. And they keep the law just for the sake of keeping the law. There's no justice or mercy or love for God, as Luke says. I think that's Luke 11, verse 42. They go from one extreme to the other, but they continue in their unfaithfulness. And so, Ezekiel 23, like I said, that's a pretty heavy chapter. But that's where we are. And that's how God looks at unfaithfulness, the unfaithfulness of his people. So I think, okay, so what's a modern day application for us? All right, well, I think of Romans chapter 7 and verse 4, where Christians are told that you have been married, that they had died to the law, that they might be married to him who is raised from the dead. So the church is the bride of Christ. All right. Well, if we as Christians or we as the church go after the other religious movements around us to be like them, we're committing spiritual adultery. We're fornicating, and we're unfaithful to God, and we'd be judged for that, just like Israel and Judah were judged for their spiritual fornication. That's how God views it. All right, the church today is the bride of Christ, and we need to wear his name, and we need to be faithful to him. I think of Ephesians 5, 23 to the end of the chapter there. All right, guys, that's enough, I suppose. Appreciate everybody being on here today. And like I said, we'll be back, Lord willing, on Monday to pick up in Ezekiel chapter 24. I don't see any questions or comments, so I'm just going to end it. If you have somebody who'd like to do these studies who is not on Facebook, send them over to our YouTube channel, Mammoth Spring Church of Christ, and all of this content is uploaded there. So thanks for being on here today, guys, and hope to see you back here Monday morning at 11 o'clock.